My name is Matthew Champion, and my paper is A Sea of Lost Words, the Medieval Graffiti Inscriptions of England's Parish Churches. Today, graffiti is viewed in a somewhat paradoxical manner, and to an extent, always has been. On the one hand, modern graffiti, leaving aside the more generally acceptable and financially lucrative street art, is generally regarded as something that is destructive, an antisocial act of vandalism. However, ancient graffiti is seen as an important historical record. Exactly where the boundary between the two lies has never been established, and certainly isn't a minefield I intend to discuss today. Instead, I will be looking at the study of historic graffiti from an archival perspective, focusing particularly upon text inscriptions found in the English parish churches. The study of historic graffiti has a long pedigree and is really nothing new. Although there was a surge in recording in the mid-20th century, it's been ongoing for many centuries. And the earliest record I've personally come across date back to, 14th century. In 1335, Wilhelm von Boldensel, a German pilgrim, traveled to Egypt, and he noticed on one of the pyramids a Latin inscription, which he recorded for posterity. The inscription itself was made somewhere in the 2nd century AD and was a memorial written by a young woman to her departed brother. I saw the pyramids without you, my dearest brother, and here I sadly shed tears for you, which is all I could do. And I inscribe this lament in memory of our grief. May thus be clearly visible on the high pyramid the name of Decimus Gentianus. However, in the last decade, the study of historic graffiti has really come of age. This is largely due to advances in technology, and in particular, the advent of affordable digital cameras. Previously, surveying historic graffiti was a time-consuming and potentially very costly business. It either involved taking rubbings, which is positively discouraged today, making drawings, or taking photographs, each of which costs money to develop and process. With the advent of the digital camera, it's now possible to survey a site in a matter of hours, which would have once taken days or weeks, and at almost no cost. This has really directly led to the rise of many community archaeology-based citizen science projects where members of the public with a minimum of training and minimal equipment can go out and make their own discoveries. It's been a real success story of the last decades. What these projects have shown is just how extensive this new archive of material really is. As you can see from this one small area of church wall in Sedgeford in Norfolk. When we began the projects in Norfolk, we believed that medieval graffiti inscriptions or early graffiti inscriptions were relatively rare. However, the more we looked, the more we found. So the general rule of thumb these days is if a church hasn't been too badly messed about with by the Victorians and isn't still covered in many layers of lime wash, then it will contain significant quantities of early graffiti. The survey of Norfolk and Suffolk churches has so far recorded in excess of 65,000 individual inscriptions, most of which had never previously been recorded. So what are we actually coming across? Well, it must be said, it's mainly imagery. Everything from faces, heraldry, ships, architectural inscriptions, ritual protection marks, just about everything you can possibly imagine finding anywhere else in the medieval world. Images of people are particularly popular. The joke amongst the graffiti hunters is if you stare at the walls for long enough, you'll soon find them staring back. Sadly, from an archival point of view in some respects, we aren't finding a great deal of text. Text accounts probably for between 5 or 10% of all the inscriptions we come across, and pre-Reformation text is even rarer. There are exceptions. Certain notable sites like Lidgate and Coolidge in Suffolk or Halton in Cambridgeshire do contain large quantities of text, clearly written by those very used to the writing arts. However, they are the exception rather than the rule. When it comes to these text inscriptions, a lot of them clearly fall into a category that we would describe as informal memorials or commemorations. These act in many cases as informal memorials for those who are too poor to be commemorated elsewhere. And most of them, of course, are associated with their death. This is one of 3 inscriptions from Bumstead Church in Hertfordshire. And as you can see, it's deeply inscribed into the pier and is clearly visible to anyone who walks into the church. This one sits really bordering between sort of the formal and the informal. And it reads, "In this middle space, at this seat's end, there lieth buried our neighbour friend, old John Grigg of Cheverell's End, anno 1598, April 15th. Excuse me. These semi-formal memorials act as a kind of halfway house. Although they are sort of created informally, they're clearly part of at least a locally accepted practice. Other of these informal memorials are far more discreet, such as this example from Lidgate Church in Suffolk. This is almost invisible to the naked eye and can only be recorded in specific raking light conditions, such as the example I'm showing you here. It can just be made out. Each of these individual letters is less than 10 millimeters high. And it reads, "John Wiseman departed this life, June 15, 1811. Now, who John Wiseman was, we really don't know. We can't find him anywhere else in the archival record. There's certainly no memorial to him in the churchyard. As far as we're aware, this may be John Wiseman's only testament to existence. Now, not all of these memorials relate to death. There are odd exceptions. But they are occasionally appropriated to mark other subjects, such as this example from Skirlaw Church in Yorkshire. It simply reads, "R.R., born 1648. Nearby, there are a number of other deeply inscribed inscriptions which all relate to members of the Rameau or Rand family, including one some decades later relating to a Ralph Rameau. So it may in fact be in this case that his birth and his death were both actually recorded and inscribed in the same church. Now, commemoration takes on many forms. Aside from the great events of births and deaths, many of the commemorative inscriptions are far more mundane in nature. At Alfred Church in Essex, there are a whole series of inscriptions all around the chancel, and as you can see, quite deeply inscribed. All of them appear to have been made by the parson or parish priest, one Nicholas Le Grice. And Nicholas, as well as feeling absolutely fine about leaving graffiti all over his own church, was very keen that his good works and his building works should be recorded in some way. So all of these building works he inscribed into the church. This chancel was repaired with new timber work by me, Nicholas Le Grice, parson, anno 1578. Moving back to Lidgate Church in Suffolk, a tiny inscription at the western end of the church commemorates a military muster that took place in the years immediately before the Spanish Armada. It reads, "T.S., 18th of January 1583, Anno Elizabeth Viniente Sext, muster at this town." Now, a military muster taking place in Lidgate would be notable simply because it is such a tiny village these days. But back in the late 16th century, it was obviously considered to have some military importance that's since been long overlooked. The TS in question relates to Thomas Smythe, who was muster master for this area of Suffolk and parts of North Essex. We know it was Thomas Smythe as he very, very helpfully left his full name inscribed on the pier slightly below. In terms of the muster itself, this tiny inscription on the wall of the church is the only known record of this event having taken place. Moving north into Norfolk and Lidgate Church, the bell ringers, who are generally notorious for leaving graffiti, commemorated the marriage and the marriages of all the couples they rang for, a tradition they appear to have continued for over 2 centuries. Now, this image before you is a tiny section of one of the window reveals. The entire chamber, the entire ringing chamber, is absolutely covered in inscriptions from floor to well above head height. There are a number of inscriptions which are actually so high up they must have actually used a ladder to reach those areas. They record not only the marriages, they also record the name of the bell ringers, they record what's going on in the village, they record the name of parsons, they record the name of individuals. You have an entire social history of the parish all on the walls of this one tiny chamber. Now, the walls also act as a repository for more tragic parish histories, too horrific or traumatic to be trusted to the relative impermanence of paper or parchment alone. Records of events that to those living through them must have appeared almost apocalyptic in nature. With the world they knew crumbling around them, they felt the need to record these events for posterity and turned to the walls of their own parish church. The most chilling of these inscriptions are those which we refer to today as plague graffiti. The most famous example is that shown here from Ashwell Church in Hertfordshire, and it's inscribed into the lower sections of the tower chamber. It's transcribed as, "There was a plague, 1,000, 3 times 100, 5 times 10, a pitiable, fierce, violent, plague departed. A wretched populace survives to witness, and in the end, a mighty wind, Maris, thunders in the year of the world, in this year in the world, 1361. So this particular inscription isn't just recording the plague, but it's also recording a great storm that took place over a decade later, causing damage to Ashwell Church Tower itself and actually bringing down the steeples of neighbouring churches. The Ashwell example isn't alone. In St Edmonds Church at Acle in the Norfolk Broads, a similar inscription, unusually written in charcoal, was discovered hidden beneath layers of limewash on the north wall of the chancel, clearly created by someone highly literate and used to the writing arts, most probably a member of the clergy. It reads, "O lamentable death, how many dost thou cast into the pit? Anon the infants fade away, and of the aged death makes an end. Now these, now those thou ravagest, O death on every side. Those that wear horns or veils, fate spareth not. Therefore, while in the world the brute beast plague rages hour by hour, with prayer and with remembrance deplore death's deadliness." Perhaps the inscription that brings home the true personal horror of living through a pandemic is that from steeple Bumstead Church in Essex. Dated to 1348, and unusually for the period written in English, the same phrase is repeated at multiple points around the church. They read simply, "God help me, God help me, God help me." Now, moving away from plague graffiti and looking at the text inscriptions in a more archival reference, being able to cross-reference a lot of these text graffiti inscriptions with other documentary evidence is actually a relative rarity. Although when it is possible, it can be enlightening. This inscription is from Troston Church in Suffolk, and as you can see, it reads Johed or Johannes or John Abthorpe. Now, we know that the Abthorpe family were actually lords of the manor in Troston from about 1400 through to about 1490, when the male line died out. This particular person, John Abthorpe, appears to also have been a witness to a number of wills, including one of the Playford wills in the 1440s and 1450s. Very clearly, this text also seems to belong to a fairly good 15th century context. Now, the problem, of course, from an archaeological perspective is we appear to have the right name in the right place and at the right time. but we still can't say with absolute certainty that this inscription was made by John Abthorpe. You know, the last three words may indeed be missing. You know, it may have read once, John Abthorpe is a git. We simply don't know. So from a purely archaeological perspective, we really have to take a very cautious approach when it comes to interpretation. However, with regards to graffiti text inscriptions in general, it must also be acknowledged that many of them simply can't be read. Perhaps the most frustrating element of all the research we undertake. In some cases, this is simply the result of wear and tear over the centuries, which has literally wiped the words from the walls, as is the case here at Swannington in Norfolk, where a long inscription relating to a lead court is now all but lost. In other cases, it's because the inscriptions were probably never meant to be read in the first place. The jumbled mumbo-jumbo pseudo-texts of charms, curses, and cures. Although major steps forward have been taken in recent decades to record all these graffiti inscriptions in English parish churches, it must also be recognised that this archive is not a static one, and it is constantly evolving. It is obviously a growing archive as more sites are examined, but also growing as new inscriptions begin to appear out from beneath centuries-old limewash, as at here at Litcham in Norfolk. These inscriptions at Litcham, which are coming out from beneath the limewash, we know were created sometime between 1412 and 1547. So in terms of the, in archaeological terms, we have quite a tight time frame. However, not all the additions to the archive are as welcome, leading to questions of retention and preservation. These inscriptions created in recent years in Norwich Cathedral were all associated with another inscription relating to the conflict surrounding Gaza. As such, they form part of the historical record and tell another chapter in the long life of the building and the manner in which people interact with it. But should they be left in place as simply another piece of the larger corpus, where they would undoubtedly be found offensive by many? In this case, they were removed, but only after they had been fully recorded and added to the archive. The fine line between vandalism and preservation being weighed firmly by modern perceptions and sensibilities. Perhaps most sadly, most sadly of all, are the losses that this newly found archive material continues to suffer year on year. Only a fragment of what was once inscribed on the walls has survived to the present day. And yet even this newly discovered archive of medieval material is under a very direct and constant threat. Restoration, conservation, and the increasingly secular uses of many of our churches are being put to has seen the ongoing destruction of this unique medieval resource, which at present benefits from no form of heritage protection. Much has already been lost, and more disappears with each passing month. Our attempts to record and decrypt this material is quite literally a race against time itself, before these hidden words are wiped forever from the walls. With no forms of legal protection for the graffiti inscriptions, as either tangible or intangible heritage, it's an irony that they benefit from less protection than the medieval wall paintings that they are scratched through. If things are not put in place in the relatively near future, then the graffiti archive that's remained hidden in the dark corners of our churches for centuries will gradually be lost. All we have as a consolation is a growing digital archive, and that, as this conference will be discussing in detail, presents as many problems as it does solutions. Thank you for listening, and if you'd like to know any more about medieval graffiti or the medieval graffiti projects, please visit the website at medieval-graffiti.co.uk, or you can find us on Twitter at medievalg. Many thanks.